Test 2 covers chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. And what it looks at as a whole is it's going to look at the energy yielding nutrients, and it's going to take a look at energy balance. So if you recall back in chapter 1, very beginning of the course, we talked about the 6 classes of nutrients. And you learned about the energy yielding nutrients. You had you had carbohydrates, you had proteins, you had lipids. Alcohol is also an energy yielding nutrient. Alcohol doesn't have its own chapter. It has an end of a chapter section in the course, but we're going to be looking at carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids in more detail. So remember, those are your energy yielding nutrients, which are going to be important. So for chapter 4, that's going to focus solely on carbohydrates. So what you're going to look at in that chapter, you're going to look at the composition of carbohydrates, composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and you're going to look at the different types of carbohydrates in the diet. So you're going to look at we're going to talk a lot about glucose, which we'll get to that a little bit later on, but we're going to look at monosaccharides, those single sugar units such as glucose. Disaccharides, going to be 2 monosaccharides joined together, and polysaccharides, which are going to be your long chain of saccharides that are being joined together. So we're going to look at those different ones. We're going to discuss your sometimes these are grouped into simple sugars and complex sugars or complex starches. So when we get to our complex guys, our polysaccharides, we're going to look at starches and fibers. Those guys are going to be important. We're going to look at the difference between starches and fibers and how it's going to deal with the difference in the bonds and their ability to be broken apart by the human body. But we'll be examining those differences. And for all of the carbohydrates, we're going to be looking at examples of food sources for them. So food sources that give them to us in our diets and their roles in our body. So it's going to be really important that you become familiar with the roles of carbohydrates in the body. And we're also going to look at carbohydrate digestion in a little bit further detail. So what happens when we ingest those carbohydrates and the importance of I mentioned glucose, the importance of glucose in our diet. You know, our cells need glucose to break down as an energy source, and we need to maintain a healthy blood glucose level. And so kind of learn what happens when that starts to get out of whack, what the body does to keep those glucose levels at bay. For chapter 4, you're going to have a set of 4 essay discussion questions, and you're also going to have a discussion board assignment. Now for chapter 5, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about lipids. We're going to talk about the different types of lipids in the diet and how they're used in the body. So we're going to look at your triglycerides, and we're going to look at the different types of fatty acid chains. So those are going to be important, and we're talking about the different kinds of fats that are in the diet for those. We're going to look at phospholipids. We're going to talk about their importance and how they're important with like your cell membranes. Those phospholipid bilayers and cell membranes are crucial to what comes in and out of the cells. And we're also going to look at sterols, which are important in things such as cholesterol. So we'll be looking at the different, again, it's kind of the same pattern as we did with carbohydrates. We're going to look at the roles and the functions of lipids in the body. We're going to look at dietary sources of lipids, and we're going to talk a little bit about the transport of lipids in the body. So we'll talk about your transport proteins that carry the lipids, your HDL, your LDL, how those can affect health and be important for health, and what each one of them is doing, what their job is, what their destination is. Well, what are they carrying and where are they carrying it? So that makes them different and plays a part in their importance with health. So again, I didn't mention this with, I did. We're going to look ahead at proteins next. I'm trying to get a little bit ahead of myself, and I don't want to do that. But we're also going to look at health effects of lipids, positive and negative. And Then you're going to have a set of essay or discussion questions for lipids, and you're also going to have a discussion board post for lipids. And we move on to proteins, which I was trying to get a little bit ahead of myself when we're talking about proteins, but we're going to talk about the composition of proteins, what makes proteins different from carbs and lipids, and that's proteins are going to have that nitrogen. And we'll talk about the composition of proteins and how they're composed of amino acids and what's an amino acid. And we're going to see how proteins are, there's amino acids linked together with peptide bonds and how they're going to fold and join together. And one big thing about proteins is that proteins have to be in the right shape in order to do their job. And so we have all these different amino acids that help make up the proteins, and how they join together and how they take a shape. It's going to depend on the function of the protein. Proteins always have to be in the correct shape to have the correct function. So one term that we're going to talk about with proteins is denaturation. And what happens with that is when a protein will lose its shape and it can't get back to its shape. If it can't get back to its shape, then it can't do its job. So that's really important with proteins. And proteins are important in many body functions. You're going to learn about that. You're going to learn about dietary sources of proteins, and often we associate those with your meats. But we're also going to look at your vegetarian diets and how they compensate for protein and the things that they need to just pay a little bit more attention to ensure that they're getting the right proteins. They're adding the complementary proteins in with their diet to make sure that they're covering all the bases for that. And we're going to look at some deficiencies that can occur without protein in the diet. And for that chapter, that's going to be chapter proteins is going to be chapter, I have to use my cheat sheet. It's going to be chapter 6. So for chapter 6, you're going to have a set of essay questions. You're going to have a discussion board assignment. And so to show you the big picture, chapters 4, 5, and 6, that's going to be carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Those are going to be your energy yielding nutrients. So we're going to look at each of those in their own chapter in deeper detail. Now for chapter 7, what we're going to look at is going to be energy. I'm going to look at your exact title, energy, nutrients, and energy balance. And so what's going to be important with that chapter is going to be just seeing about how the nutrients are balanced out in the body. What happens if you take in more than you're burning? And so how do we keep an energy balance? And for chapter 8, you're going to have a quiz. And chapter 8 is going to end this section of 4 chapters. And so you're going to have a test at the end of that. It's going to be called Test 2. It's going to cover chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so for chapter 7, you're going to have that quiz. But for the discussion, it's going to be the discussion that covers. It's going to be the larger discussion. It's going to be worth more points. And you're also going to have a Test 2, which will cover those 4 chapters, multiple choice setup, just like the previous test. So that is your big picture at what's coming up and the topics that are covered, and just to kind of keep you on pace and to understand how this all fits in together. So for this section, again, we're going to be taking a deeper look at all those energy yielding nutrients, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and we're going to look at how they can balance in the body, and we'll have a test that covers that. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.